Under the microscopic lens, the plague bacterium multiplies with terrifying speed. It is a biological wildfire devouring healthy tissue. But listen to the real sound of mass extinction. It is not a bomb. It is the rhythmic, heavy thud of a rubber stamp hammering the words, "Top Secret," onto a beige government folder. You are looking at a freshly declassified military archive. That stroke of black ink at the bottom of the page is a signature. And that signature just officially pardoned a monster. You believe the global rules of war and international justice form a shield around your life. You are dead wrong. The front line of modern biodefense, the very geopolitical order keeping you safe right now, was literally purchased with the blood of vivisected prisoners. If you do not understand how easily human morality is liquidated for raw survival data, you are walking through a minefield. You remain completely blind to the ruthless, calculated reality of the world you actually inhabit. We are stripping away the lingering illusion of the good war. By taking you directly to the frozen crime scenes of Manchuria and cutting through the redacted intelligence files of the Cold War, we will expose an existential terror. To the apex predators who govern this planet, the state machinery of survival recognizes no human rights. When the apocalypse is on the table, you are not a citizen. You are simply biological material waiting in the dark to be processed and catalogued. We cross the threshold into the desolate, snow-covered ruins of the Pingfang facility in northeast China. The wind howls through shattered concrete. It is minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The epidemiological investigator presses a hand against a rusted iron gate, sensing the physical weight of standing on a mass grave. The frost bites through the heavy fabric. We have just stepped onto the killing floor of a military slaughterhouse, perfectly disguised to the outside world as a civilian lumber mill. The investigator surveys the icy perimeter, hunting for the ghost of the pathogen in the frozen earth. The paper trail begins in 1936. The Japanese Imperial Army officially established the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. It sounds benign, a medical frontline against infectious diseases. But that bureaucratic title was a lethal deception. It was the cover name for what rapidly mutated into the absolute nightmare of Unit 731. You must understand the sheer industrial scale of the horror. This was not some rogue laboratory in a basement. The complex at Pingfang occupied more than 2.5 square miles. It contained over 150 custom-built structures. Through the investigator's eyes, the layout makes terrifying military sense. It featured dedicated rail lines, a private airfield, heavily fortified prison blocks, and the towering smokestacks of a massive biological incinerator. The surrounding civilian population was fed a highly coordinated lie to maintain operational security. They were told this massive, heavily guarded site was simply a lumber mill processing local timber. The true horror lies in the bureaucracy of that lie, which birthed the darkest code word in military history. The living human beings dragged inside these walls were stripped of their names and classified by the guards simply as Maruta, a Japanese word that translates directly to logs. When you legally classify a human being as a piece of timber, you bypass every psychological barrier to murder. The investigator kicks at the frozen dirt, knowing that beneath this topsoil lies the ash of countless victims. They were resistance fighters, prisoners of war, and innocent civilians swept off the streets. Men, women, and children fed directly into an industrial meat grinder. The human empathy circuit was completely severed by the cold, sterile language of a military spreadsheet. This was not battlefield chaos. This was a regulated front line, where the weapons were pathogens and the casualties were carefully measured data points. For nearly a decade, the incinerator chimneys of Pingfang smoked day and night. The facility functioned with terrifying corporate efficiency. The architects of this nightmare generated mountains of lethal data, pushing the absolute boundaries of human biological endurance until the Japanese Empire finally collapsed in 1945. The empire fell, and the time for international reckoning finally arrived. We shift our optics from the frozen ruins of Manchuria to the blinding flashbulbs of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. It was the Japanese equivalent of Nuremberg, a grand theater of justice designed to prove that the architects of atrocity would face the hangman's noose. The military generals, the politicians, the men who ordered the invasions, they are all sitting in the dock, listening to their ultimate death sentences. The tribunal executes its brutal, necessary mathematics. We watch the archival footage as the masterminds of the Pacific War are marched to the gallows. The trapdoors swing open. The world applauds the absolute triumph of international law. But look closely at the courtroom benches. Look at the empty spaces. The investigator feels a cold dread, but has nothing to do with the winter wind. There is a massive, gaping hole in this narrative of global justice. A complete blackout of accountability. Where are the doctors? Where are the brilliant, highly educated scientists who designed the Pingfang complex? The men who authorized the vivisections, who harvested the plague fleas, who systematically murdered thousands of logs with their bare hands and glass test tubes. They are completely absent from the courtroom. Not a single researcher from Unit 731 is sitting in the defendant's chair. They have simply evaporated from the theater of war. It is a statistical and historical impossibility. You do not vaporize an operation of that magnitude without leaving a massive paper trail. So we are left with the ultimate, terrifying paradox. How did the architects of the most sophisticated biological death factory in human history simply vanish from the gallows? They did not escape. They were not hiding in the shadows. They were officially erased from the record, legally shielded by the very superpower that claimed to be delivering justice. The masterminds of this biological death factory vanished from the gallows because their crimes were meticulously captured, not in blood, but in ink. We leave the freezing winds of Manchuria and step into the suffocating silence of a modern, climate-controlled archive. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, a gloved archivist carefully turns the fragile, yellowed pages of a captured Japanese laboratory logbook. The air in this reading room smells faintly of decaying paper and institutional dust. Through the eyes of the archivist, we are not looking at photographs of atrocities. We are staring down into neat, endless rows of meticulously handwritten numbers and complex medical charts. These are not mere data points on a graph. You are looking at the exact, mathematically measured final moments of human beings. The true existential terror radiating from these files is the absolute illusion of humanity. You expect the authors of these ledgers to be raving monsters, sadists driven by unhinged bloodlust. But the archives reveal something far more chilling. The men operating this slaughterhouse were highly educated professionals. They were disciplined, rational scientists executing a state-sponsored protocol. They maintained perfectly normal, idyllic family lives right on the base. The blueprints of the Pingfang complex show a community swimming pool, well-kept playgrounds, and a fully equipped movie theater. Researchers would watch films with their wives, push their children on swings, and then walk a few hundred yards across the compound, to resume their work in the heavily fortified infection wards. This is the front line of a very different kind of war, where the enemy is the very concept of human empathy. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. A scientist could kiss his daughter goodnight, walk past the armed perimeter, and immediately transition into a butcher. They completely compartmentalized their reality, viewing the thousands of living, breathing captives solely as experimental biomass. The ledgers detail a ruthless pursuit of biological truth. To formulate weapons-grade pathogens, the researchers required pristine, uncorrupted data. Chemical interference from painkillers or sedatives would alter the physiological response, rendering the resulting metrics useless for military application. Therefore, they enforced a strict, terrifying rule. Anesthesia was absolutely forbidden. The archivist turns to a section titled Surgical Pathology. Victims were routinely subjected to vivisection. They were surgically opened with scalpels while fully awake and hyper-aware. The doctors needed to observe the real-time progression of hemorrhagic fevers and necrotic infections on living internal organs. They tracked the collapse of the human system second by agonizing second. The human body was treated as nothing more than a temporary vessel for disease. The doctors stood over screaming patients with stopwatches and clipboards, noting the exact discoloration of a failing liver or the precise swelling of an infected spleen. This was the cold, rational bureaucracy of survival at its absolute darkest. The ledgers provide a concrete, horrifying demographic breakdown of this slaughter. Conservative estimates confirmed by military intelligence state that at least 3,000 men, women, and children were systematically murdered inside the Pingfang facility. This experimental population was specifically targeted, comprising primarily Chinese civilians and captured Soviet soldiers. The victims included political dissidents, resistance fighters, and entirely innocent families swept up by the military police. Pregnant women were infected to study fetal transmission rates. The Japanese Imperial Army stripped these 3,000 individuals of their names, their nationalities, and their fundamental human rights, officially classifying them merely as logs for the mill. We track survival metrics in modern epidemiology to measure the success of a treatment. But the ledgers of Unit 731 track only the efficiency of extermination. Not a single prisoner who entered the fortified gates of the Pingfang complex ever walked out alive. The survival rate for this massive, state-funded medical research initiative was precisely, mathematically, exactly 0%. Let that number sink into your mind. 0%. Even in the most brutal combat zones, even in the most devastating natural disasters, there are always anomalies. There are always survivors who beat the odds. But Pingfang was a perfectly closed system of death. It was a factory where the raw material was human flesh, and the only permitted export was actionable military intelligence. The archivist closes the file, the heavy cardboard cover sealing away thousands of agonizing deaths. You are looking at the foundational currency of the Cold War. These pages, stained with the ultimate suffering, were not treated as evidence of a war crime by the victors. They were treated as an asset, a priceless scientific treasure just waiting to be purchased by the highest bidder. That priceless scientific treasure was not forged in a sterile, peaceful laboratory. I'm standing back in the frozen ruins of Pingfang, where the temperature has plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howling through these shattered concrete foundations carries the echoes of the ultimate betrayal. The ledgers you saw were just the final accounting. Down here in the mud and the ice, you find the actual testing grounds where human biology was systematically dismantled. The investigator looking at these ruins does not see a mere prison. Through the lens of modern epidemiology, this is a weapons manufacturing plant. A high-speed camera reconstructing the past captures the violent freezing of water into ice crystals. This was not a passive observation of disease. The architects of this facility engineered nature itself into a weapon of mass destruction. They were building a reliable delivery system for the apocalypse. You think of a biological weapon as a virus in a test tube, but weaponization requires a battlefield application. The pathogen is only the warhead. You need a missile. To the men running this camp, the human body was merely a ballistics testing dummy. They needed to know exactly how the human organism fails under extreme, combat-simulated stress. The data they harvested here is written in frost and necrosis. Survival in a winter war dictates the fate of empires. The Japanese military needed absolute, pristine data on human endurance in sub-zero environments. They did not use animal models. They used the prisoners. To study the optimal treatment for winter combat injuries, human subjects were dragged outside into the biting -40°F weather. There was no anesthetic. There was only the brutal stopwatch of the observer. The methodology was unimaginably cruel, yet meticulously recorded. The guards drenched the prisoners' exposed arms in freezing water. They waited as the skin blistered, turned purple, and finally went black. The process continued until the limbs were frozen completely solid. To test the density of the frozen tissue, the researchers struck the arms with wooden sticks until they sounded like a solid wooden board. This was weapons-grade research, yielding data that could not be legally obtained anywhere else on Earth. The investigator mapping this site feels the crushing weight of that truth. We use this exact data today to treat severe frostbite and hypothermia. The protocols that might save your life in a blizzard were authored by men shattering the frozen limbs of screaming prisoners. Morality did not survive the cold. But ice was only one element of their arsenal. The wind howling through Pingfang gives way to a different, more insidious sound. It is a terrifying, scratching hum, vibrating through the glass of archival footage. We are moving from the freezing courtyards into the incubation rooms. Here, they weaponized the very vectors of the Black Death. They were not trying to cure the plague. They were trying to unleash it. The facility bred plague-infected fleas on a massive, terrifyingly industrial scale. This was not a small-scale laboratory experiment. It was a factory assembly line designed to cultivate a living nightmare. They used thousands of rats, feeding them to the fleas, to create a biological stockpile capable of wiping out entire cities. The sheer volume of this production defies basic human comprehension. The epidemiologist standing in the ruins of the incubation chambers calculates the horrifying output. At peak operational capacity, this facility was harvesting up to 66 pounds of lethal, plague-carrying insects in a single cycle. 66 pounds. Millions upon millions of infected parasites, buzzing and starving, waiting to be unleashed upon a fragile civilian population. It is an ocean of manufactured death. Having cultivated the ultimate biological payload, the scientists faced a ballistics problem. How do you drop a living, fragile weapon from a bomber without the explosion incinerating the fleas? Standard steel munitions generated too much heat upon impact. The parasites would burn before they could infect a single target. The military required a precise, low-temperature delivery system to shower the enemy with infection. The engineers found their answer in a deceptively simple material. They developed the Uji-type porcelain bomb. This casing was designed to shatter perfectly at low altitudes. It would explode just above the ground, effectively showering enemy cities with thousands of plague-carrying fleas without incinerating the fragile biological payload inside. It was an engineering marvel of pure evil. This was not a theoretical blueprint. These porcelain bombs were manufactured, loaded onto aircraft, and dropped on Chinese villages as live field tests. The investigator traces the outbreak vectors, watching the artificially induced epidemics spread across the map. Entire communities were annihilated simply to calibrate the blast radius of a clay shell. The civilian population was completely defenseless against this manufactured plague. You want to believe that science is an inherently noble pursuit, driven by a desire to heal. The ruins of Pingfang shatter that illusion permanently. The men who designed the Uji bomb were brilliant physicists and biologists. They applied the scientific method with flawless precision to maximize human casualties. They proved that human intellect is completely divorced from human empathy, treating massive civilian populations as mere data points. I am standing on ground zero of a biological apocalypse that was successfully contained only by the collapse of an empire. The frostbite data, the flea yields, the blast radius of the porcelain bombs — this was the terrifying intelligence portfolio of Unit 731. They possessed the exact mathematical formulas for mass extinction. And as the front lines began to collapse, this data became their only currency. The ice is cracking. The Soviet tanks are rolling across the border. The architects of this plague know that if this facility is captured, they will hang. The investigator feels the panic that must have gripped this frozen compound. They had to destroy the physical evidence, but they desperately needed to save the data. The midnight purge was about to begin, and the ultimate geopolitical bargain was about to be struck. The rumble of Soviet armor is not just a distant echo. It is a violent shockwave shattering the frozen earth of Manchuria. The front line has collapsed entirely. The geopolitical shield that protected this slaughterhouse is gone. To the archivist, staring at the declassified timelines, the panic of that moment is palpable. The scientists are no longer predators. They are prey. Thick, black smoke rises against a gray sky, choking the air with the smell of burning fuel and secrets. Oil drums are ignited across the compound. The archivist examines extreme close-ups of charred logistical logs recovered from the ashes. This is not a strategic military retreat. It is a desperate, frantic scramble to erase reality itself before the world arrives. You might think a falling regime fights to the last man to defend its fortress. The truth is much darker. The ultimate priority is never the soldier, it is the data. As the Red Army breaches the outer perimeter, the commanders of Unit 731 initiate the Midnight Purge. A final, horrific directive is issued. The abyss demands a final, bloody tribute to maintain the silence. It is August 1945. Over 1 million Soviet troops crossed the border, executing one of the most rapid and overwhelming offensives in modern military history. The invasion cuts through the fortified Japanese defenses like a surgical scalpel. The pristine isolation of the Pingfang complex is suddenly and completely compromised by the advancing front. The response from the Japanese High Command is absolute and immediate. The emergency order is transmitted across the crumbling network. Initiate the complete destruction of the Pingfang facility. Every microscope, every centrifuge, Every single shred of evidence tying the Imperial Army to the biological weapons program must be vaporized. The order is a total erasure of historical truth. The archivist traces the paper trail of this sudden panic. The intercepted cables are brief, tactical, and stripped of all scientific arrogance. Heavy demolition charges are wired directly to the reinforced concrete walls of the prison blocks. The fires in the massive incinerators are pushed far beyond maximum capacity. They are trying to burn the plague out of existence. But you cannot simply burn human memory with gasoline. You cannot detonate the surviving test subjects without someone on the outside hearing the screams. The facility was an active factory of death, and the assembly line was still full. The men who quantified human suffering now face a severe logistical nightmare. What do you do with the living evidence of your war crimes? To ensure absolute silence, the final operational protocol is activated. There are exactly 400 prisoners remaining in the fortified compound. These are 400 living, breathing human beings, Chinese dissidents, Soviet intelligence officers, and civilian collateral. 400 voices that could easily send the entire scientific staff to the executioner's block. They are systematically executed without a shred of hesitation. This is not a chaotic battlefield massacre. It is a clinical, industrial disposal process. The remaining prisoners are either poisoned by hydrogen cyanide gas pumped directly into their cells, or methodically shot by firing squads in the courtyards. In the cold mathematics of survival, their lives are simply a liability. Through the archivist's lens, the sheer bureaucracy of this final slaughter is paralyzing. There is no ideological fanaticism in these final reports. It is just treated as standard pest control. The universe does not intervene to stop the poison gas from flowing. The cosmic horror is the total absence of justice. 400 complex human universes are extinguished just to balance a ledger. The mastermind does not stay to burn alongside his monstrous creation. General Shiro Ishii, the supreme architect of this biological terror, abandons the facility immediately. He secures the most critical asset, the extracted human data, and flees back to the Japanese mainland on a military transport plane. He leaves the low-ranking soldiers to face the incoming Soviet wrath. Before disappearing into the chaos of the collapsing empire, Ishii issues his absolute final command to his fleeing subordinates. They are explicitly ordered to conceal their true identities, to scatter into the ruined civilian population, and to take the secret of Unit 731 to their graves. This ensures the contagion of silence infects the entire remaining chain of command. But fire is an incredibly imperfect destroyer. The archivist holds a surviving, charred ledger under the harsh reading room lights. The concrete was pulverized, and the bodies were reduced to ash, but the core mathematical models survived. The essential, horrific blueprints for weaponized disease escaped the flames, meticulously packed in the leather briefcases of the fleeing scientists. This is the precise moment the official narrative fractures permanently. The evidence of mass murder did not burn. It was weaponized as geopolitical currency. If this scale of historical manipulation blows your mind, too, hit the like button. To not miss the terrifying solution to this mystery, subscribe to the channel. Do you think international law ever stood a chance? Let me know in the comments. The thick smoke finally clears over the ruined, frozen foundations of Pingfang. The advancing Soviet army captures an empty, burning shell of a facility. The killers have seemingly vanished into thin air, and the world believes the nightmare is over. But across the Pacific, a new superpower is analyzing the intelligence landscape. The deadliest transaction in human history is just about to begin. The smoke still clings to the frozen ruins of Manchuria, but the real front line has already shifted south. We are in a claustrophobic interrogation room in post-war Tokyo. The air is thick with the acrid smoke of unfiltered cigarettes. A single, violently bright overhead bulb illuminates the sweat on the faces of the captured. The hunt is officially over. The architects of the apocalypse have been run to ground by the advancing Allied war machine. But the atmosphere inside this room is completely wrong. This is not the righteous fury of a war crimes tribunal. There are no handcuffs slamming onto the table. There is only the quiet, terrifying rustle of translated transcripts and the scratching of fountain pens. You expect to see the triumph of justice, the brutal reckoning for the thousands murdered in the frost. Instead, you are witnessing the birth of a terrifying bureaucratic synergy. Look closely at the men sitting across from the captured Japanese scientists. They are not military police. They are not prosecutors sent to avenge the dead. The predators have simply recognized each other in the geopolitical jungle. The American officers reading these files do not see sadistic monsters. They look into the eyes of the butchers of Pingfang and see esteemed colleagues. They see men who possess a terrifying currency worth infinitely more than gold. This is the ultimate existential horror of the modern age. When the survival of the state is on the line, the illusion of human morality evaporates instantly. The men in this room are stripping away the propaganda of the good war. They are operating on a cold, rational calculus, where the value of a human soul is absolute zero. But the data extracted from its destruction is priceless. You are entirely expendable to the men who run this world. The United States government did not send its top legal minds to interrogate the command structure of Unit 731. They deployed a specialized, highly classified vanguard. The interrogators chain-smoking in this Tokyo basement are the top biological warfare experts straight from Camp Detrick in Maryland. They are the tip of the spear for the American biological weapons program, sent specifically to secure the bleeding edge of lethal science. These scientists from Maryland crossed the Pacific with a singular, ruthless objective. The Soviet Union is rapidly locking down Eastern Europe, and the shadow of the Cold War is already freezing the globe. The experts from Camp Detrick know they are in a desperate arms race. They are not here to read Miranda rights. They are here to audit the most comprehensive, lethal laboratory operation ever constructed on the face of the earth. As the translators painstakingly convert the captured Japanese ledgers into English, the atmosphere in the room shifts from interrogation to awe. The Camp Detrick experts are staring at the holy grail of biowarfare. The neat mathematical columns detail the exact lethal dosage required to collapse the human respiratory system. It is a roadmap to human extinction, meticulously categorized and beautifully graphed. The American investigators quickly realize the magnitude of the Japanese achievement. They are reading deeply detailed, real-time pathology data on the human reaction to weapons-grade anthrax, bubonic plague, and cholera. This is not extrapolated theory derived from mice or monkeys. This is the gold standard of biological research. It is the pure, unadulterated mechanics of how the human machine fails when flooded with weaponized pathogens. This level of scientific certainty was completely inaccessible to American scientists. The laws of the United States, the rigid ethical constraints of the Western medical tradition, absolutely forbade the deliberate infection and vivisection of human subjects. The researchers at Camp Detrick were effectively flying blind, guessing at the human lethality of their own weapons. The men sitting across the table just handed them the cheat code to mass death. I want you to feel the cold, terrifying pragmatism in this room. The American scientists are looking at data harvested from the screaming lungs of Chinese and Soviet prisoners. They know exactly how this information was acquired. They know the subjects were tied to stakes and bombed with plague-carrying fleas. But in this smoky Tokyo room, the screams are silenced. The victims are scrubbed away, leaving only the pristine, undeniable perfection of the numbers. The chain of command ignites with a frantic, electrified energy. The investigators immediately begin drafting highly classified communiques back to their superiors in Washington. The initial reports sent from this basement describe the information obtained from the Unit 731 scientists as being of the absolute highest intelligence value. The data is entirely unprecedented in the history of human warfare. The telegrams flying across the Pacific are devoid of any moral hesitation. The American experts explicitly inform the Pentagon that this captured research will vastly accelerate the United States biological weapons timeline. The Japanese have essentially completed 10 years of the most dangerous, ethically impossible research, and packaged it neatly for the victors. The American bioarsenal is about to leapfrog the Soviet threat overnight. The bureaucratic machinery of the United States government begins to pivot with terrifying speed. The Pentagon realizes that if this data falls into the hands of the advancing Soviet intelligence apparatus, the geopolitical balance of power will shatter. The men who orchestrated the systematic slaughter of over 3,000 people are no longer viewed as war criminals by the American military establishment. They are classified as vital strategic assets. The trap is springing shut, and justice is the bait. You are watching the exact moment the international rules of engagement are quietly taken out back and executed. The treaties you rely on to protect your life are nothing but fragile ink on paper, instantly dissolved by the acid of military necessity. The interrogators in this room are preparing to make a deal with the devil, and they are using the pulverized bones of Pingfang to pay the toll. The transcripts are finalized. The Japanese scientists understand the leverage they hold. They know the Americans are desperate, terrified of the impending Soviet menace. A silence falls over the interrogation table as the ultimate, unspoken question hangs in the cigarette smoke. What is the precise market value of 1,000 vivisected humans? The answer is about to be drafted into a top-secret memorandum that will stain the American soul forever. The answer to that horrific question is not found in a courtroom, but on a typewriter ribbon in a classified Pentagon vault. While the public watches the Tokyo trials, a completely different reality is codified in the shadows. Look at the split screen of history. On one side, the gallows at Sugamo prison stand ready. On the other, clerks meticulously log files. The crack of the executioner's trapdoor synchronizes perfectly with the heavy thud of a rubber stamp. That stamp does not say guilty. It says approved. You are witnessing the exact moment a superpower legally purchases the fruits of a mass murder. Through the eyes of the archivist, the declassified memos tell a story of pure, chilling pragmatism. There is no moral debate here. High-level American officials are simply weighing the abstract concept of international justice against the hard biological data harvested from the frozen corpses of Manchuria. The archivist sifts through these fragile, yellowed pages and finds no hesitation, only a cold, utilitarian calculus. To the military mind, prosecuting these scientists is a waste of a strategic resource. The Soviets are massing on the borders of a ruined Europe. The next war will not just be fought with steel, but with pathogens. And sitting in the interrogation rooms of Tokyo are the only men on Earth who know exactly how a human body reacts to weaponized plague. The paperwork reveals the mechanics of the ultimate betrayal. A formal, top-secret agreement is struck in the sterile language of statecraft. The terms are terrifyingly simple. The United States government demands the complete inventory of the Pingfang facility. They want the blueprints, the pathogen strains, and the meticulously recorded death agonies of the victims. In exchange, the architects of this slaughter demand something priceless. The price for this apocalyptic knowledge is absolute immunity from war crimes prosecution. The United States officially guarantees that General Shiro Ishii and his top researchers will never face a tribunal. They will never stand on the gallows. The deal trades the lives of thousands for 8,000 slides of human tissue and years of vivisection reports. The transaction is bloodless on paper, but it effectively pardons the worst atrocities of the 20th century. This is not a rogue operation orchestrated by a few overzealous intelligence officers. The archivist reads the routing slips and sees the ink of the highest echelons of the American government. The deal is approved at the absolute top of the chain of command. The primary objective is not just to acquire the biological weapons data, but to keep its existence completely hidden from the Soviet Union and the international prosecutors. You have to understand the sheer scale of the deception required to pull this off. While prosecutors at the Tokyo trials hunt for evidence of atrocities, the American military actively hides the most prolific mass murderers in their custody. The entire legal framework established to punish the crimes of World War II is deliberately bypassed. The system is rigged. The rules of war are revealed as nothing more than a convenient fiction applied only to the losers who have nothing left to sell. The most damning piece of evidence in the vault is a classified memo authored by American investigator Edwin Hill. The archivist stares at his signature, feeling the profound existential dread of a man reading a receipt for human souls. Hill does not write about the horror of the freezing experiments or the screams in the pressure chambers. He writes with the enthusiasm of an accountant who just found a loophole. Hill explicitly writes that the Japanese data was obtained at a fraction of the cost it would take to acquire elsewhere. Read those words again. A fraction of the cost. He is coldly ignoring the thousands of human lives that paid that price in the torture chambers of Pingfang. The document proves that the American biological warfare program views the victims not as murdered civilians, but as subsidized research subjects. Their suffering is simply a discount on the defense budget. This is the front line of a moral collapse. Stand in the trenches of this archive and realize what this means for you. If you believe that human rights are an impenetrable shield, this paper trail proves you wrong. When the survival of the state is threatened, your life, your dignity, and your demand for justice are instantly expendable. The architects of the post-war world order looked into the abyss, saw a weapon that could wipe out millions, and decided to buy it. The cosmic horror here is the crushing realization that there is no grand moral arc to the universe. There is only power, and the data required to maintain it. The gallows at Sugamo Prison are a theatrical performance designed to satisfy the public's need for closure. Meanwhile, the true masters of life and death, the scientists who mastered the art of biological annihilation, are quietly ushered out the back door with their pockets full of American pardons. The archivist traces the shipping manifests. The 8,000 tissue slides and the vivisection reports do not just sit in a warehouse. They are loaded onto cargo planes and flown across the Pacific. This is the moment the infection spreads. The biological data harvested in the freezing hellscape of Manchuria is injected directly into the veins of the American military-industrial complex. The horror of Pingfang is not destroyed. It is simply relocated and rebranded. Think about the prisoners who froze to death, hoping that history would avenge them. Their final moments were meticulously logged, and those very logs became the currency that bought their killers freedom. Every agonizing breath they took under the scalpel was converted into a data point that fortified a new empire. The victims did not die to expose the evil of Unit 731. They died to optimize the next generation of global biowarfare. The vault door swings shut on the concept of universal justice. The files are sealed under the highest classification levels, locked away in the dark for decades. The world moves on, entirely unaware that the foundation of the coming Cold War is soaked in the blood of human experimentation. The terrifying truth is that civilization is not protected by morality. It is protected by a ruthless calculus that values a lethal virus over a human conscience. The files are stamped, the vault is secured, and the perpetrators simply walk away into the dawn of a new era. They trade their military uniforms for lab coats, disappearing into the civilian infrastructure of a rebuilding nation. The data they provided is about to trigger a chain reaction in the West. We are about to see what happens when the absolute worst of human nature becomes the foundational blueprint for modern biodefense. The ink dries on the immunity papers, and the contamination begins immediately. This is not a metaphor. The physical data harvested in the freezing slaughterhouses of Manchuria is placed onto military transport planes. We are watching the most toxic cargo in human history cross the Pacific. The front line has shifted. The war of artillery is over, but the war of pathogens is just beginning. The geopolitical temperature plummets. We are entering the Cold War. You look at the archival footage of the era and see mushroom clouds blooming over testing sites and concrete missile silos sinking into the earth. But the true doomsday machinery is much quieter. It hums under the fluorescent lights of pristine, heavily guarded biodefense laboratories. The apocalypse is being cultured in a petri dish. Step inside one of these modern, brightly lit clean rooms. The epidemiologist stares through the lens of an electron microscope, analyzing the defensive protocols designed to protect you from biological annihilation. But look closer at the algorithms. Look at the baseline pathology models. The investigator recognizes the phantom signatures woven into the very fabric of our modern survival strategies. These are the ghosts in the machine. We believe our medical security is a triumph of ethical, modern science. You sleep soundly, believing in the morality of the system. But the foundation of that system is a mass grave. The data points tracking the spread of pulmonary anthrax or pneumonic plague were not simulated on computers. They were measured by timing the death rattles of living, breathing prisoners. The logistics of this dark inheritance are ruthlessly efficient. The thousands of human tissue slides purchased with American pardons do not sit idle. They are secretly transferred straight into the heart of the United States military apparatus. They arrive at Fort Detrick in Maryland. This is ground zero for the next generation of warfare, and it is being fertilized with the blood of Unit 731. The data does not just inform the research, it dominates it. The agonizing logs of vivisections and frostbite trials become a foundational pillar for the United States' own biological warfare and defense programs. The Pentagon looks at the terrifying Soviet threat looming in the East, and they counter it using the operational blueprints drawn up by the worst war criminals of the 20th century. It is a terrifying parasitic relationship. The American military-industrial complex absorbs the Japanese research, integrating the mechanics of mass infection into the architecture of the Cold War. The United States government effectively crowdsources its doomsday preparations from a syndicate of mass murderers. Morality is a luxury the superpower simply refuses to afford when survival is on the line. And what happens to the architects of this nightmare? While the Americans build weapons from their ledgers, the monsters simply go home. Protected entirely by the United States government, the scientists of Pingfang strip off their military uniforms. They do not face the hangman's noose. They do not face tribunals. They walk freely into the booming economy of a rapidly rebuilding post-war nation. They infiltrate the highest levels of society. Many of these former Unit 731 researchers go on to hold prominent, prestigious positions in the post-war Japanese medical establishment. The men who dropped plague bombs on civilian populations and froze limbs until they shattered become university deans. They become respected pediatricians. They take control of the pharmaceutical industry. This is the ultimate existential terror. The evil was not defeated. It was promoted. The individuals who orchestrated a factory of human slaughter are now designing the medicine you take to cure a headache. The infection of their methodology bleeds directly into civilian life. You interact with the legacy of their horrific ambition every single time you step into a modern hospital or fill a prescription. But you were never supposed to know this. The transaction was too dark, too deeply corrosive to the narrative of the righteous victor. The United States government constructs an impenetrable wall of silence around the entire operation. They maintain a strict, absolute denial of the immunity deal. The fact that American biodefense relies on the torture of innocents is classified at the highest possible level. This wall of silence holds for over 50 years. For more than half a century, the nature of the Japanese atrocities and the cynical American complicity are kept locked away in dark, climate-controlled vaults. 2 entire generations are born, live, and die, believing the comforting lie that the Allies brought all the monsters to justice. The truth is buried deeper than the victims in Manchuria. We fought a devastating global war against fascism, only to quietly ingest its most demonic methodologies. The investigator in the sterile lab knows the terrifying reality. You look at the hazmat suits, the sterile pipettes, the complex chemical equations, and you realize they are all contaminated. The global geopolitical order is completely infected by the very atrocities it publicly condemned. The scale of this betrayal shatters the illusion of a just universe. The Cold War arms race is heavily fueled by the combustion of human souls in the Pingfang incinerators. We did not destroy the factory where humanity died. We simply bought the patents and optimized the production line. The terror is not a foreign enemy. The terror is the ruthless, calculating machine of our own state survival. The files remain classified, the perpetrators die peacefully in their beds, and the bioweapons stockpile grows. The global superpowers stare each other down across a divided world, their arsenals locked and loaded with the ghosts of the vivisected. We have survived the century, but we have done it by making a permanent pact with the abyss. And the abyss is about to demand its final payment. The abyss is about to demand its final payment. I'm standing back where this nightmare began, in the shattered, frozen foundations of the Pingfang complex. The wind howling through these rusted iron gates is the only sound left on this killing floor. The dust has settled on the greatest crime of the 20th century, and the silence here is absolutely deafening. You look down at this cursed earth, and then you look up. High above the Manchurian frost, a modern military satellite blinks against the endless, indifferent blackness of deep space. That piece of orbital machinery represents the global security apparatus that shields you while you sleep. But you and I now know exactly what fuel was burned to launch that system into the sky. The true horror of Unit 7731 is not found in the raw, physical brutality of the frostbite tests or the vivisections. The ultimate terror is the cold, terrifying mathematical logic of the superpowers that absorbed those findings. We stared into the eyes of a monster, only to realize the monster was simply a bureaucrat with a ledger, calculating the exact geopolitical exchange rate of human agony. We tracked the paper trail from the blood-stained snow of Harbin to the sterile interrogation rooms in Tokyo, and finally to the secure vaults of the Pentagon. What did we learn from the casualties? We learned that when the grand, noble architecture of international justice was tested against the strategic value of human suffering, justice collapsed immediately and silently. The gavel never fell for the architects of the plague. The post-war tribunals were an illusion, a comforting bedtime story told to the survivors. Behind closed doors, the victors looked at the horrific data harvested from 3,000 murdered souls and saw nothing but tactical advantage. They granted full immunity to the butchers because the laws of human morality are instantly discarded when a state requires lethal intelligence to guarantee its own survival. This is the front line of our existential reality. You live every single day in a world constructed entirely upon this utilitarian calculus. The sophisticated biodefense systems and epidemiological protocols meant to protect modern civilization are deeply rooted in the darkest violations of human life. The 8,000 slides of human tissue bought with absolute immunity became the foundation of our current security. The universe looking down on us does not possess a moral compass. It operates on the ruthless mechanics of cause and effect. To the vast, calculating machinery of global superpowers, you and I are not citizens endowed with unalienable rights. When the threat level rises and the margins of survival narrow, we are simply biological data points. We are Maruta. We are raw material waiting to be processed. The myth of morality is the luxury of peacetime. The chilling conclusion of this entire investigation is not just that the United States government made a deal with the devil in 1945. The cosmic dread lies in the absolute certainty that the system governing your world today will make the exact same calculation tomorrow. If the survival of the state demands it, your rights will evaporate in a heartbeat. We have mapped the ruins, we have read the declassified reports, and we have survived the descent into the archives. The infection of this history is permanent. The institutions that dictate the rules of engagement are the very same institutions that shielded the most prolific murderers of the modern age. The war never truly ended. It simply relocated from the battlefield to the laboratory, operating in absolute secrecy. If this investigation shattered your perception of the global order and forced you to confront the cold realities of our history, hit the subscribe button. Join us in the trenches. We will continue pulling the redacted files from the fire, exposing the brutal mechanics of power that operate just beneath the surface of your daily life. The truth is an ugly casualty of war, but it is the only weapon we have left. Our journey ends here, in the freezing shadows of a slaughterhouse disguised as science. The data has been locked. The criminals have died as respected elders, and the world keeps spinning in the dark. Remember this when they speak of justice. The foundation of our safety is built entirely on the bones of the forgotten. The storm has passed, but the fallout is eternal. This is the War Crimes Archivist, signing off.